The lights inside the Vatican Secretariat of State went dark at exactly 11:47 p.m. Not because of a power failure, because someone had pulled the plug. And what Pope Leo XIV had seen on those screens in the 7 seconds before they went black would set off the most explosive financial crisis in the history of the Catholic Church. It was the night of July 3, 2026. A Thursday, the kind of night when Rome's summer heat sits heavy on the city like a wool blanket. The kind of night when most of the Vatican sleeps. But not Leo. Not tonight. Because 3 hours earlier, a brown envelope had arrived at his private study inside the Apostolic Palace. No return address, no seal, just a single USB drive, and a handwritten note in Italian that read, "They will never show you these numbers voluntarily." Before we continue with the story, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you are watching from. Your support means everything and keeps these stories alive. Leo sat at his desk for a long time, turning the USB drive between his fingers. He could feel the weight of it. Not physically, it weighed almost nothing, but the weight of what it implied. Someone inside the Vatican, someone with access to financial systems that were supposed to be locked behind layers of bureaucratic secrecy, had decided to betray the institution. Not to the press, not to Italian prosecutors, to the Pope himself. That distinction mattered. Whoever sent this believed that Leo was the kind of man who would act on it. He didn't call his secretary. He didn't alert Vatican security. He plugged the drive into his personal laptop, the same one he'd brought with him from his days as prior general of the Augustinians, the same machine that had no connection to the Vatican's internal network. And what he saw made him close his eyes and press his palms flat against the wooden desk. Rows of numbers, hundreds of them, account codes that didn't match any official Vatican ledger, transfers routed through banks in Luxembourg, the Cayman Islands, and Singapore. Some dating back decades, some as recent as 3 weeks ago. And the amounts were staggering. Not millions, hundreds of millions, moving in complex circles, leaving no trace on any report that had ever been submitted to the Council for the Economy. Leo scrolled slowly. Each new page revealed another layer. Intermediary accounts holding companies with Latin names, wire transfers, time-stamped at 3 a.m., 4 a.m., the hours when oversight sleeps. He recognized none of the account numbers, but he recognized the pattern. He'd seen it years ago when he'd been asked to review the financial practices of Augustinian missions in Latin America, the pattern of money that doesn't want to be found. He picked up his phone and called exactly one person, Cardinal Matteo Ferrara, the newly appointed prefect of the Secretariat for the Economy. Ferrara was 61. Milan, trained in both canon law and forensic accounting. Lao had handpicked him 4 months earlier over the fierce objections of at least 5 senior cardinals who wanted someone more experienced. More experienced in Vatican terms usually meant more compliant, more willing to look at the numbers he was shown, and not ask about the ones he wasn't. Ferrara arrived at the Apostolic Palace at 1:15 a.m. He was still tying his shoes when Leo handed him the laptop. Ferrara scrolled in silence for nearly 10 minutes. His face changed 3 times during that period. First confusion, then recognition, then something that looked a lot like dread. He looked up and said 3 words. "This is real." Leo nodded. "I want every account opened, every transfer traced, and I want it done before I leave for Lampedusa tomorrow morning." Ferrara stiffened. "Holy Father, that gives us less than 18 hours. Then you should start now." But what neither of them knew was that someone had already been watching, someone inside the Curia who had spent years making sure those accounts stayed invisible. And that person had just received a notification on a private encrypted phone that the USB drive had been accessed. The notification didn't come from the Vatican's IT department. It came from a custom-built piece of monitoring software installed on the drive itself, a trap, and Leo had walked straight into it. By 6 a.m. on July 3rd, Ferrara had assembled a team of 4. 2 forensic accountants from ASF's newly restructured office, the Authority for Financial Supervision and Information, which Leo had overhauled just the day before on July the 2nd, eliminating its president and board, and replacing the entire leadership with a director who answered directly to the Pope. 1. Digital security specialist brought in from the Vatican, Jean de Marie and Sister Lucia del Veo, a 53-year-old nun from the Congregation for Institutes of Consecrated Life, who had spent 20 years working in international banking before taking her vows. She was Ferrara's secret weapon. She could read a balance sheet the way a cardiac surgeon reads an angiogram, spotting blockages, irregularities, and dangers that others would miss entirely. They set up in a windowless conference room on the second floor of the palace of the governor. No phones allowed inside, no laptops connected to the Vatican network, just the USB drive, printed spreadsheets, and a whiteboard that would soon be covered in red ink and arrows, connecting names to numbers to dates. Sister Lucia was the first to spot it. A pattern, buried deep in the transfer records. Money flowing from the Institute for Works of Religion, the Vatican Bank, the IR, into a holding company registered in Luxembourg called Domus Petri Holdings. On paper, Domus Petri appeared to be a legitimate real estate management firm. It had a website. It had listed directors. It filed annual returns with Luxembourg's commercial registry. Everything looked clean. But Sister Lucia recognized 2 of the directors' names. They were priests, both assigned to the Secretariat of State, both currently serving under Cardinal Aldo Brancusi, the Secretary of State himself. The same man who just 6 weeks earlier had stood beside Leo at a press conference and praised the Pope's commitment to financial transparency. Ferrara set down his pen. Are you telling me the Secretary of State has a private investment vehicle running off Vatican bank funds? Sister Lucia didn't blink. I'm telling you that approximately $240 million euros have moved through this entity over the past 7 years, and none of it, not a single euro, appears in any filing submitted to the Council for the Economy or disclosed during the ASF review process. The room went silent. The 2 ASF accountants exchanged a glance. The GRE specialist stopped typing. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the air conditioning unit mounted above the door. But what they discovered next made that number look small. Domus Petri wasn't alone. It was connected to a web of at least 11 other shell companies spread across 4 jurisdictions: Luxembourg, the British Virgin Islands, Singapore, and Liechtenstein. Each one linked through layered ownership structures back to accounts at the IUR. The money moved in a specific pattern out of the IUR into Doe Petri, from Doe Petri into the shell, companies from the shell companies into investment vehicles, and from the investment vehicles into real assets. Luxury real estate in London, Paris, and Geneva, private equity stakes in tech companies, even a vineyard in Tuscany. And some of it, this was the part that made Ferrara's hands shake, had been redirected into personal accounts belonging to 3 sitting cardinals, not operational accounts, not discretionary diplomatic funds, personal bank accounts in their own names. One of them had received 17 separate deposits over 4 years, totaling more than $212 million. Leo received the preliminary report at 9 a.m. He was in his chapel. Morning prayer, the same routine he'd kept every day since becoming Pope. 30 minutes of silence before the Blessed Sacrament, followed by Lauds. Ferrara waited at the door, holding a single sheet of paper with the findings condensed into 12 lines. When Leo finished, he took the paper, read it once, folded it, and placed it inside his breviary. How many people know about this? Leo asked. 6, including you and me. Keep it that way for now. Leo had a decision to make, and it wasn't simple. He was scheduled to fly to Lampedusa the next morning, July 4th, for a pastoral visit that had been planned for months. A visit centered on migrants, on suffering, on the moral duty of welcome. It was the 250th anniversary of American independence, and he, an American pope, had deliberately chosen to spend it, not waving flags but praying at a cemetery where anonymous migrants lay buried after drowning in the Mediterranean. The symbolism was important. The world was watching. Canceling would raise questions he wasn't ready to answer. But leaving Rome meant leaving the investigation at its most critical and vulnerable stage. He chose to go, but not before giving Ferrara one instruction. That would change everything. Before I return from Lampedusa, I want Cardinal Brancusi in my office. Don't tell him why. Don't tell anyone why. Just make sure he's there. Ferrara hesitated. Summoning the Secretary of State without explanation was almost unheard of. Brancusi was 74 years old, a creature of the old Curia, a man who had served 3 popes and navigated every internal power struggle of the past 4 decades. He knew where every secret was buried, because he'd buried most of them himself. Confronting him without airtight, legally defensible evidence was dangerous. Not physically, politically. Brancusi had allies everywhere in Rome, in Washington, in Beijing. But Leo wasn't asking for permission. He was giving an order. On the morning of July 4th, as Leo boarded the helicopter to Lampedusa, 2 things happened simultaneously in Vatican City. The first was routine. The Vatican press office released the Pope's schedule for the day. Mass at the Arena sports field in Salina, a visit to the Gateway to Europe monument, prayers at the migrant cemetery overlooking the sea. The second was anything but routine. Sister Lucia, working alone in the governor's conference room while the others took a brief rest, found a 13th account. This one was different from the others. It wasn't connected to Domus Petri. It wasn't linked to any of the 3 cardinals. It was tied to a numbered account at a private bank in Zurich that had received a single deposit of 97 million on March 15, 2020. That date meant something. It was 5 weeks before the beginning of the Vatican's criminal investigation into the disastrous London property deal. The $350 million euro purchase that had resulted in losses exceeding a $100 million and led to the trial and conviction of Cardinal Angelo Bettu. The timing couldn't be a coincidence. $97 million moved into a numbered Swiss account just weeks before the investigation that was supposed to clean up Vatican finances. It looked like someone had been preparing for the storm, moving assets to safety before the auditors arrived. She called Ferrara immediately, but Ferrara didn't answer. His phone had been confiscated 30 minutes earlier by 2 members of the Vatican D'Army, acting on orders from someone Ferrara had never met. They hadn't arrested him, they hadn't accused him of anything, they had simply stopped him in a corridor, asked for his phone for a routine security check, and walked away. When he protested, one of them had shown him a signed authorization. The signature was illegal. The letterhead was from the Secretariat of State. Meanwhile, on Lampedusa, Leo stood in a windswept cemetery overlooking the Mediterranean. The graves were marked with simple crosses. Some had names, most didn't. Below him, the sea that had swallowed thousands stretched blue and impossibly calm, as if nothing had ever happened in its depths. He prayed in silence, his white classic moving in the hot wind. But his mind was not entirely on the dead beneath his feet. Part of him was calculating, planning, running scenarios. He was a man who'd studied mathematics before entering the priesthood. He understood systems. He understood how power structures protect themselves. And he understood that the next 48 hours would determine whether his papacy would be remembered for reform or for failure. What happened next unfolded faster than anyone expected. At 2:30 p.m., while Leo was celebrating Mass on the island, Ferrara was released. No explanation was given. His phone was returned, but when he turned it on, he found that 3 of his encrypted files had been remotely deleted. The backup USB drive that had been locked in the conference room safe was gone. Anne's sister Lucia was sitting in the hallway outside the room, pale-faced, clutching her rosary so tightly her knuckles were white. "They came in while I was printing the Zurich account documents," she whispered. 2 men in dark suits. They didn't show identification. They didn't speak. They took the backup drive and placed a folder on the table. Inside was a single photograph of my sister's house in Naples. My sister and her children were in the front yard. Ferrara felt something he hadn't felt since his early days investigating the Bank of Ambrosiano collapse in the 1980s. Fear. Cold, genuine fear. Not for himself, for the investigation, for the Pope, for Sister Lucia's family. Because whoever had sent those men wasn't just trying to hide money, they were trying to protect a system that had been operating inside the Vatican for decades under multiple papacies with the quiet consent or willful ignorance of men who wore red. He called Leo directly. The Pope answered on the second ring, stepping away from a group of Lampedusa officials who were waiting to escort him to the monument. Ferrara told him everything: the confiscated phone, the deleted files, the stolen drive, the photograph. There was a long pause, the sound of Mediterranean wind. Then Leo said quietly, and with a stillness that was more frightening than any outburst, "Is Sister Lucia safe?" "She's with me. She's scared. Move her to the spank to my private floor. Post 2. Swiss guards outside her door. Guards I've personally approved. Call Commander Rugg and give him my authorization code and the investigation. It continues without pause, without compromise. Another pause that I'm coming back tonight." Leo landed back in Rome at 8:45 p.m. on July 4th. The official reason given to the press was fatigue from the Lampedusa trip in the summer heat. The real reason was that he understood with absolute clarity that the window for this investigation was closing by the hour. Every minute that passed gave the other side time to destroy evidence, time to coordinate stories, time to build a wall of institutional silence that even a pope might not be able to break through. By 10 p.m., Leo Ferrara, Sister Lucia, and 2 of the original XIV investigators were gathered in Leo's private study on the 3rd floor of the Apostolic Palace. The room was small, lined floor to ceiling with books, theology, philosophy, mathematics, history, a wooden crucifix above the desk, and a photograph of his parents on the shelf. The air conditioning barely worked, and the Roman heat pressed against the windows, but the atmosphere inside that room was electric. Sister Lucia presented what she had managed to save before the drive was taken. She had photographed 47 pages of documents on her personal phone, a phone that had been in the pocket of her habit, not on the table, before the 2 men entered the room. She'd been trained in banking. She knew how to preserve evidence. And she had learned during her 20 years in the financial world that the most important records are the ones someone doesn't want you to see. Those photographs now showed something none of them had expected. The Zurich account wasn't just receiving money, it was distributing it. Monthly payments had been going out to 14 different recipients across Europe and South America for over 5 years. Some were charitable organizations, legitimate ones doing real work. Some were political lobbying firms in Brussels and Washington, and 3 of the payments recurring. Steady, never missing a month, went to law firms in Rome, London, and Buenos Aires that had been directly involved in suppressing clerical abuse investigations between 2009 and 2016. Money from the Vatican, flowing through secret accounts into the hands of lawyers whose job had been to silence victims. Leo stood up from his chair. Slowly, he walked to the window and looked out over St. Peter's Square. It was empty at this hour. The basilica glowed golden against the dark Roman sky, the dome rising like a promise or a lie depending on what you knew about what happened behind its walls. "This isn't just corruption," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is a machine built to protect itself, fed by the institution it was supposed to serve." He turned back to the room, his eyes were clear. His voice, when he spoke again, carried the flat certainty of a man who had made a decision from which there would be no retreat. "Tomorrow morning I want 3 things. First, a formal request was sent to the Swiss Financial Market Supervisory Authority through our new ASF director, requesting full disclosure of the Zurich account under our mutual legal assistance framework. Second, I want the names of every cardinal, bishop, and manuscript connected to any of these entities, every single one on my desk by noon. And third," he paused. The room held its breath. "I want Cardinal Brancusi summoned, not invited, not requested, summoned to appear before me at 3 p.m. in this room. And this time nobody interferes. Nobody confiscates anything. Nobody threatens anyone. Am I understood?" Ferrara wrote everything down. Sister Ludia blessed herself. The ASF investigators nodded. But the night wasn't over. At 11:30 p.m., Leo's private phone rang. The number was blocked. He answered anyway. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, and unmistakably Italian. "Holy Father," the voice said, "you're making a grave mistake." Leo said, "Nothing." He listened. "These accounts exist for reasons you do not fully understand. They serve the church. They have always served the church in ways that do not appear in official documents, in ways that cannot be explained, to journalists or prosecutors or even to well-meaning reformers." "Who is this?" A slight pause. "Someone who has protected this institution for longer than you've been a priest. Someone who watched you arrive from America with your tennis racket and your optimism and thought, perhaps this one will learn. Perhaps this one will understand that some walls exist for a reason." "The wall I found wasn't built for protection," Leo said. "It was built for concealment. There's no difference. Not in this church, not in this city." The line went dead. Leo didn't sleep. He sat in his private chapel until dawn, alone with the silence and the weight of what he'd uncovered. He thought about his predecessor, Francis, who had tried so fiercely to clean the Vatican's finances, raiding the Secretariat of State, stripping it of its investment portfolio, creating oversight bodies, and pushing through criminal trials. And yet, the system had survived, had adapted, had grown new limbs in new jurisdictions with new names and new faces, like a vine you cut at the root that simply sprouts from a different wall. He thought about the Becciu trial, the conviction, the fines, the imprisonment. The Vatican had declared victory, the press had moved on, and behind the celebration, the machine had kept running quieter, smarter, more careful, and he thought about that voice on the phone, the calm certainty of it, the patronizing tone, the assumption that a pope could be contained, that this American, this outsider who played tennis at Castel Gandolfo on Saturday mornings and said the rosary in English would eventually learn his place. By 7 a.m. on July 5th, the formal request to Swiss authorities had been transmitted. By 9:01 a.m., the list of names was on Leo's desk to contain 23 names: cardinals, archbishops, men, seniors, some retired, some active, some sitting in offices less than 200 meters from where Leo was now reading their names. 3 of them had attended his installation mass 14 months earlier. 1 of them had helped him vest. 1 had given the homily at his first Christmas midnight mass. At 10 a.m., something unexpected happened. Cardinal Brunussi didn't wait for his 3 p.m. summons. He appeared at the Apostolic Palace unannounced, flanked by 2 senior men who served as his personal aides and requested an immediate audience with the Pope. The Swiss guard at the entrance hesitated. The protocol required advanced scheduling. Ferrara, who happened to be crossing the hallway, made the call on the spot. "Let him in." Brancusi entered Leo's study with the posture of a man who believed he was still in charge. 74 years old, silver hair swept back, dark eyes that had looked across negotiating tables at prime ministers, intelligence chiefs, and heads of state. He sat down in the leather chair opposite Leo's desk without being invited. A small act of defiance, a signal. "Robert," Brancusi said, using Leo's given name. A deliberate act of condescension, stripping away the papal title, to remind Leo that Brancusi had been a prince of the church when Robert Post was still teaching geometry in rural Indiana. "We need to discuss what your people have been doing inside the governorate." Leo didn't react to the use of his first name. He didn't flinch. He didn't correct him. He simply let the silence hold for 3 full seconds, a technique he'd learned not in seminary but in mathematics, where the pause before revealing a proof is sometimes more powerful than the proof itself. Then he opened a folder on his desk and slid it across to Brunussi. "These are the accounts your office has been hiding from the Council for the Economy." Leo said his voice was flat, almost conversational. Domus Petri Holdings, 11 associated shell companies across 4 jurisdictions, €240 million in undisclosed transfers over 7 years. a numbered account in Zurich receiving and distributing funds to 14 entities, including 3 law firms directly involved in suppressing clerical abuse investigations. Brancusi didn't look at the folder. He kept his eyes locked on Leo. "Those accounts are operational instruments," Brancusi said slowly. "Every Secretary of State since Casaroli has maintained discretionary funds for sensitive diplomatic work that cannot be conducted through official channels. This is not corruption. This is how the Holy See has operated on the world stage for half a century." "Diplomatic work," Leo repeated, "including monthly payments to firms whose sole documented purpose was preventing abuse survivors from testifying." For the first time in the meeting, Brancusi's composure cracked. Not dramatically, not visibly to someone who didn't know what to look for, but Leo saw it. A micro-expression, a flicker in the left eye, a slight, almost imperceptible shift of weight in the chair. The body language of a man who has just realized that his opponent knows more than expected. "I don't know anything about those specific payments," Brancusi said. "Then you won't object to a full investigation." "You are the Pope," Brancusi said, and now there was steel beneath the silk of his voice. "But you are not omniscient. You cannot unravel 60 years of institutional architecture because you found something on a USB drive that offends your American sense of transparency. This church has survived for 2,000 years. It has survived schisms, wars, plagues, and revolutions. It will not be saved by spreadsheets and forensic accountants." Leo leaned forward. His hands were flat on the desk. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "It won't be saved by secrets either. Calling each other on private phones." Those on the list, the 23, scrambled to understand how much Leo knew, how much could be documented, how much evidence could still be deleted, shredded, or moved before the XIV investigators reached it. But they were too late because at 1 p.m., Ferrara executed the second phase of Leo's plan. Acting under the authority of the newly restructured ASF, the authority Leo had specifically redesigned for exactly this kind of moment. He issued formal preservation orders for all financial records held by the IU, the Secretariat of State, and the administration of the patrimony of the Apostolic See. Every digital file, every paper, ledger, every archive box, every safe sealed under the direct and personal authority of the Pope. Anyone who destroyed, altered, or concealed any financial record from this moment forward would face immediate canonical penalties, including potential excommunication. The head of the IR, a layman named Marco Andreotti, received his order at 1:15 p.m. He read it twice. Then he called Brancusi. No answer. He called again. Nothing. A third time. Silence. He then walked personally to the secretary out of state and found Bruni's office empty. The desk had been cleared. The computer wiped to factory settings. The personal safe, a heavy iron box built into the wall behind a painting of St. Peter, stood open and empty. Andreotti called Ferrara. "He's cleaned his office. Everything is gone. Where is he?" Nobody knows. But Brancusi hadn't left Vatican City. The Swiss guard confirmed he had not passed through any gate. His car was still in its assigned spot. He was inside the walls somewhere. They found him at 4:30 p.m. in the Vatican Gardens, sitting alone on a stone bench near the Lord's Grotto, the reproduction of the famous French pilgrimage site nestled among the ancient trees and manicured hedges behind St. Peter's Basilica. No aides, no phone, just an old man on a stone bench. His red-trimmed cassock dark against the green hedge staring at a statue of the Virgin Mary. And while the summer light filtered golden through the umbrella pines, Ferrara approached carefully slowly. "The way you approach someone at the edge of something, Your Eminence, the Holy Father is asking for you." Brancusi looked up. His eyes were red. Not from crying. Men like Brancusi don't cry from exhaustion, from the accumulated weight of decades of knowing things that couldn't be said, carrying secrets that couldn't be shared, maintaining a machinery of shadow and silence that had for 60 years operated in the space between what the church preached and what it practiced. And now that machinery was being dragged into the light by an American who said the rosary in English and believed with apparently genuine conviction that the truth could set an institution free rather than destroy it. "Tell him I'll come," Bernousi said quietly. "But tell him this too. What is opened cannot be closed again, and not everyone who falls will deserve to." The second meeting happened at 6 Campus p.m. This time Brancusi was a different man. The arrogance was gone. The condescension had vanished. In its place was something harder to read. Resignation, perhaps, or a deeper kind of calculation. The calculation of a man deciding how much truth to offer in exchange for how much mercy. He confirmed the existence of Dois Petri. He confirmed the discretionary accounts. He provided context for some of the transfers, diplomatic backchannels to secure the release of hostages in conflict zones, payments to informants in countries where Christians were being persecuted, funding for Catholic communities operating under authoritarian regimes that had outlawed the church. Some of it sounded legitimate. Some of it was gray, the kind of gray that exists only in the shadow space where institutional survival meets moral compromise. And some of it, he admitted, he could not explain. "There were others before me," Brancusi said. "I inherited a system. I maintained it because I believed it served a purpose. I did not create it." "Who created it?" Leo asked. Bernousi was silent for a very long time. The clock on Leo's desk ticked. Shadows moved across the floor as the sun shifted behind the basilica. "If you follow the Zurich account far enough back," Broussais finally said, "you will find names that will hurt this church more than anything I have done." "I'm not afraid of names," Leo said. Brancusi looked at him with something that might have been pity or admiration, or both. "You should be." Leo dismissed Bernousi at 7 roast p.m. He instructed Ferrara to continue the investigation without restriction, without pause, and without any difference to rank or title. He authorized the ASIF director to engage external forensic auditors, a first in Vatican history. No internal Vatican accounting firm would handle this. The auditors would come from outside. They would answer to the Pope alone. And he made one final decision that night, one that would send shockwaves through the entire Catholic world when it was announced. He ordered the preparation of a formal papal decree, a motto of proprio that would require every Vatican to cast haste, every office, every congregation, every juncture, every pontifical council to submit complete and unredacted financial records to the Council for the Economy within 60 days. No exceptions, no exemptions, no appeals, no discretionary redactions. Every euro accounted for, every transfer documented, every account disclosed. The decree would be signed the following week, and its title, chosen by Leo himself, left no room for ambiguity. It would be called Lux in Arcana, Light into Secrets. On the morning of July the 6th, Leo left for Castel Gandolfo. He appeared on the balcony of the Apostolic Palace overlooking the town's piazza, blessed the residents gathered below, and settled into what the Vatican press office described as the beginning of his summer rest. But there was no rest. Not for Leo, not for Ferrara, not for the 23 names on that list, not for the anonymous voice that had called in the night. Because behind the ancient walls and the Mediterranean silence, behind the fountains and the manicured gardens and the centuries of accumulated tradition, the most thorough financial investigation in Vatican history was just beginning. In the days that followed, Italian newspapers carried anonymous quotes from senior Vatican officials expressing deep concern about what they called destabilizing reforms driven by idealism rather than understanding. 3. Cardinals requested emergency meetings with the Pope. All 3 were denied. A 4th submitted his resignation from the congregation for the doctrine of the faith. Leo accepted it within the hour. The Swiss banking authority confirmed receipt of the Vatican's formal request and indicated it would respond within the standard 30-day window. But privately, through back-channel diplomatic communications, Swiss officials signaled that the scope of what the Vatican